Well, today we have a special guest with us, Fahmy, the former ambassador of Egypt to the United States. He's also a scholar of international relations and currently serves as a dean in the American University in Cairo. Ambassador Fahmy received his degrees from the American University in Cairo. He also received an honorary Doctor of Letters from the Monterey Institute of International Studies. He is the founding dean of the School of Public Affairs at AUC. He has held numerous posts in the Egyptian government since 1974. He has also served as a member of the Egyptian mission to the United Nations for many years. He served as ambassador of the Arab Republic of Egypt to the United States from 1999 to 2008. He also served in Japan as ambassador from 1997 to 1999, and before that he was the political advisor to Egypt's foreign minister from 1992 to 1997. Ambassador Fahmy is a career diplomat who has played an active role in numerous efforts to bring peace to the Middle East, as well as international and regional affairs. He headed the Egyptian delegation to the Middle East Peace Process Steering Committee in 1993, and the Egyptian delegation to the Multilateral Working Group on Regional Security and Arms Control, which emanated from the Madrid Peace Conference of 1991, if you guys remember that. That was important way back then. He was elected vice chairman of the first committee on disarmament and international security affairs of the 44th session of the United Nations General Assembly in 1986. From 1999 to 2003, he was also a member of the UN Secretary General's Advisory Board of Disarmament Matters, where he served as the board chairman in 2001. He has written extensively on Middle East politics, peacemaking, regional security, and of course more recently on issues of the Arab Spring. His talk today is entitled Current Political Developments in Egypt, Implications for U.S. Foreign Policy. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Nabil Fahmy.
Let me start off with an anecdote. In coming up here, I just decided to get an international driver's license. And for some reason in Egypt to do that, you have to tell them, send your passport over. So I did, and I'm born in New York. So I got into a good 15, 20-minute discussion about whether I was American or not. And I couldn't convince the officer that I was not American. And he just came back to me and he said, look, I know American law. If you're born there, you're American. I said, well, I know American law as well, but I was born there and I'm not American. And this is just a driver's license, so why just give me the driver's license? Anyway, ultimately I had to explain to him what my status was here 62 years ago, 61 years ago. It's careful when you get that old, you start counting them. But anyway, what I'm going to be talk to you about today, of course, is Egypt, but it will affect the world generally, especially countries that have an interest in the Middle East. And the U.S. is, I think, a paramount player in our region, but also has tremendous interest in the region. So I think I hope it'll be pertinent to you. I did promise to be brief, but being a Middle Easterner, having been trained in the UN, that's not an easy thing to do. So, I mean, and brief is relative. So I'll just do what I can to not bore you, and then I will give you enough time to ask questions. I left government practically in 2008. And 2006, I actually wrote what people thought was a crazy memo, because it was all about Egyptian domestic politics, where I basically said, we need to get our house in order, otherwise we're going to get in trouble. Now, I had no idea we'd have a revolution in 2011, so I'm not claiming to have thought this was going to happen, but you could sort of see the ferment of different issues coming up that would lead to a really heated, engaging debate if Egyptians did not see reality for what it was. As is the case in most cables, either it wasn't read or was ignored, because nothing happened with that. I ultimately left government about a year or so later, and 2 years later we had the the revolutions in Tunis and then Egypt, and then you saw what happened in Libya. and Yemen. But before leaving Washington, I went to speak, or to answer questions actually, at the Philadelphia Inquirer. And I remember vividly that I was asked, will we have an Arab Spring? This was, again, before the revolutions. And I said, we don't have spring in the Middle East. We have long, hot summers. Now, I accepted the metaphor. I knew what the message was. And frankly, I thought it was going to happen. But I hesitated then, and I hesitate today, to use the word Arab Spring. One, because the kind of transformation we need to do takes time. There's no way it can be done in a short period. And that's frankly one of the problems we're facing now. Expectations were so high that people, myself included, are extremely frustrated about what's happening. You cannot transform systems in the way that they, from where they had been to where we would like to see a spring in a short period of time. And secondly, yes, we're not used to spring. So to move from a season that tends to be either, well, a very long, hot season, to something where the weather changes every day in, day out, well, we're not used to quick change in the Middle East. So there's also that factor which needs to be taken into account. I have consequently never used the word Arab Spring in any of my talks. I don't even use the word revolution, because now in my academic capacity it gets me into a long debate with the scientists what revolutions are and what they're not and so on. So I dropped that. I actually believe the closest thing that describes what happened, and hopefully what will continue to happen, is an Arab awakening. If you walk the streets of Cairo today, everybody wants to get engaged in determining what's going to happen in the future, even to a fault. I mean, Egyptians become activists on steroids now. Everybody wants to get engaged. And they're arguing everything, which is annoying, it's problematic, but it's healthy, because having these people engage will ultimately determine that we develop a system that has multiple stakeholders and ultimately have the checks and balances. Now, why did it happen, though, in the Middle East? Some of the reasons were nothing to do with the Middle East. I think one of the strongest factors was technology. And I don't mean by that only Facebook. I mean essentially by that the easy transfer of information around the world, including in the Middle East. If you have the information, you get the knowledge, and ultimately you think about it and you want to make your choices. In the Middle East, satellite television was much more of a factor than Facebook or Twitter, but Facebook or Twitter were as well. So the first point really is this information revolution made people think and showed people in the Middle East that they had choices and options. Secondly, we basically had a serious need for better governance. There were complaints across the board from the rich, because they weren't becoming richer, from the poor, because while there was growth, you actually had increased poverty, even as you saw growth. And then you can get into, of course, the inequities in the political system and so on and so forth. The players then were, if you'd like, above board, on the surface, publicly. The main players were the regime, which is the political establishment, the military, which always had its say, or people assumed it would have its say, and every now and then you'd have an activist appearing here and there. The Islamists, who clearly are stronger than people thought, were all under the table. In other words, they were not legitimate anywhere throughout of our system. The distribution of power in the executive sense was, of course, very strong in favor of the regime and the military, while if you looked at it in terms of the power in the street, here you saw the informal networks, the underground networks, the Brotherhood, the Salafis, and so on and so forth. So these were things that were fermenting in the process. Now I would add to all of that, by the way, and this is also why technology comes in very importantly. 56% of the population of my country alone is 25 years and younger. 60% below 30. Now, a quarter of the Middle East lives in Egypt. So these figures would basically stand for the Arab Middle East. Maybe a little bit less, 1 or 2%, but essentially you have a very, very young population and a very, very old ruling regime. And this huge gap in the middle. Youngsters, by definition, feel empowered, feel indestructible, and always want change, while the other side of that coin are exactly the opposite. Then if you don't have a link in between them, then it's a formula for instability. But anyway, let me get back to the political system. The challenge we're facing today, and what we've seen over the last 2 years really, is what will be Egypt's political identity. Egyptians will always tell you we're the mother of the world. It's great to say, and I'll accept that. Or we're in the middle of the world. I'll accept that as well. But at the end of the day, Egyptians 7,000 years ago were different from Egyptians 5,000 years ago, and my son, who is 29, is different from me. So not only what will the Egyptian be in the 21st century, what will the political identity of the Egyptians be, and you apply that to the Arab world, it also applies. Now, again, I mentioned, in the past, above board you had the regime, the military, and a couple of activists. Now, you have actually, and the Islamists were below board. Now what you have is the Islamists and the liberals above board and the military under the table. The actual military's role in politics is not defined yet. So it's really a different set of players. Nevertheless, what we had then and what we have now still hasn't changed enough. And one of the fundamental problems is there's excessive authority at the center, excessive authority at the top. We have not yet developed a system with the appropriate checks and balances that determines what you can do, what you cannot do, and how you hold your government accountable. We're in the process of doing that, and the debate about the Constitution, which I'll get into in a second, or in a few seconds, I think is important here. Now, I mentioned one of the big issues that caused change was the youth bulge. I also mentioned that why the Arab world rather than Latin America or Asia. Well, we had this severe problem of governance and the misuse of the rule of law. An example of that is in Egypt, for example, we had what we called an emergency law, which was never very well used, by the way. It wasn't used in the fashion in which one would assume, or as horribly as one would assume, but it was misused. But the problem with it was, how can it be an emergency law if it continues for 30 years? And that actually gives you more political weight than deterrent, but it makes the process dysfunctional. Secondly, there were tremendous institutional deficiencies. What is the actual separation of powers between the executive organs, the judiciary, the parliament? On paper, it looks great. But if you have, and this is what we had in November 2010, if you have one party after the elections getting 90% of the seats in parliament, and then you have all of these different other branches of government done either by appointment or by election with that kind of majority, then you're obviously not going to have the checks and balances. Another point, which was really amusing in hindsight, especially for somebody like me having left government, is to follow the media. Media in Egypt was probably where the former president was the most liberal. He actually allowed the media to do almost whatever they wanted. When he got, or the government got annoyed, they would arrest somebody every now and then, but then release him. And there was a particular case of Ibrahim Isa in particular, where he basically declared the president dead. And that led to a drop in the stock market of over $1 billion over the weekend. Now, with a very small stock market, that's a lot of money. So it was considered to be an attempt to destabilize the country, and he was quickly brought into court and held overnight in prison, and then the president allowed him to come out. So he announced again the president was dead. And he was on television after that. Nevertheless, if you watched, the point I'm trying to make here is that while former President Mubarak became more liberal in terms of the media by allowing different outlets to open up, different papers to open up, the official government media still acted like an old regime. So the process was becoming completely dysfunctional, and that's where the recipe for revolutions, where you lose control of all the organs of government. And one important organ here was the media. It was no longer the source of information, which it had been during Nasser and Sadat and during the first part of Mubarak's year. The other reason for the anger and frustration, although this was not immediately a rallying cry during the 18 days of the revolution 2 years ago, was the economy. We had been growing at an average of 5%. From 2005 to 2008. It actually had reached 7%. We had made significant reforms in the investment and economic environment. Reserves had been up to 36 billion by 2010. At the same time, you had increased poverty. 22% of the Egyptian population was below the poverty line. Now, with a 7% increase for 3 to 4 years, and an average 5% for more than that, and you're still getting an increase in poverty, shows you the disparity, the rich and the poor, and the lack of proper economic systems. We've also had a huge bulge in youth unemployment, particularly the educated youth unemployment. So you have a growing economy, the rich becoming richer, increased unemployment, and increased poverty at the same time. And the actual loss of white-collar jobs more than the blue-collar jobs. So you have more educated youth standing on the street or not making enough money to make their ends meet, and they're obviously going to create a problem for you if you don't solve it rather quickly. Another factor which needs to be taken into account, especially as we look forward, is 30% of the Egyptian budget was actually spent on energy subsidies, and another 25 to 26% on public sector salaries. So a large amount of the budget was being paid in salaries and covering subsidies in the energy sector, which needed to be resolved, couldn't be resolved in the growth period. Now will become a problem as we go through the revolution. So you want to correct your economy, you need to reduce subsidies on energy and subsidies on foodstuffs, but it would be political suicide to try to do that now and completely inconsistent with the objectives of the revolution. But this is something just to keep into account. I don't want to spend too much time on the other economic figures, but let me simply mention that the official inflation rate is 10%. The real rate is probably about 50% more than that, about 15%, and I'm being conservative. Tourism had reached 13% of our GDP, but tourism is down 45% over the last year and a half. So again, what you're seeing here is a shrinking economy. The growth rate presently is about 1.2%. The projections by the government, or the goals by the government, are to get 4 to 5% within the next 2 years. That would be a miracle, frankly, to solve all these problems and have a growth rate of 4%. When I was still in government, which was back in 2008, we needed to create 750,000 new jobs every year to meet the number of graduates leaving college and also to make up for unemployment. Now we need to make 1 million. After the revolution, 2 years after it, the situation now is such that we actually need to create 1 million new jobs a year just to play catch up with the situation on the ground. All of the sources of revenue have shrunk over the last 2 years of the revolution. Production is down, and therefore taxes are down. I mentioned tourism is down 45%. So the revenues from tourism, and that's a very heavy employment sector. So that also creates a problem in the employment area. We are being very creative in how not to take an IMF loan. But I think we're being, when I'm saying very creative, I'm falling back on my diplomatic years. I think it's the wrong thing to do. We should have taken the loan at least 1.5 years ago. Now the terms of the loan are actually tougher than they were 1.5 years ago. Our economic situation is much more difficult. We need to have about $45 billion in investment this year. There's no way we'll get anywhere near that. So what we're trying to do is to create resources by borrowing from sovereign funds, borrowing from different countries. The Qataris have offered money, the Turks have offered money. Everybody else has offered money provided we sign the IMF loan. Everybody else who has offered money has said so provided we sign the IMF loan. If we sign the IMF loan, it means reducing subsidies on energy and foodstuffs. It means liberalizing or floating the exchange rate. The Egyptian pound has gone down 8% over the last 4 weeks, and we haven't floated the exchange rate yet. So the real challenge is, how do you do all of this in the middle of a transition, revolutionary process, and just before an election for parliament, which is going to be in April? I mention these things because these are the kinds of real-life challenges that whoever is in government, in this case in Egypt today, it's the Islamists, or the Brotherhood, essentially, with support from the Salafis, that they will have to take. And I just can't imagine how they will be able to take those serious decisions over the next 3 to 4 months, and that will make the situation on the ground actually much more difficult, both for them and for non-Islamists. But let me move back to the political situation. About a month ago, everybody was talking about Egypt going bankrupt, economically bankrupt. And Egyptians, for some reason, got into an academic discussion about what is economic bankruptcy. So I decided to be different, and I wrote an article saying, well, we're on the verge of political bankruptcy. And if you can't solve that, we're going to get into a much more serious problem than whether you're economically bankrupt. And I just tried to imagine a more serious problem than that, and it gives you the general environment in the country at this point. Let me describe to you in layman's terms what's happening in Egypt. First of all, I was telling Dr. Nazar, everybody in Egypt is the boss now. Everybody there's a breakdown in the sense of authority. Nobody wants to accept authority from anybody, even if your boss is being fair. And this is a function of not having authority for so long. So now everybody's claiming authority. And if you don't get what you want, well, if you do, you ask for more. If you don't, then you demonstrate in the street. It's normal. It's not something which is particularly helpful, but it's a phase we need to go through. Secondly, the military are now back in the barracks. And my assessment is, having tried to participate in government for 18 months, they want to remain in the barracks. And they will remain in the barracks as long as there's no significant violence in the street. That's my assessment. I'm not going to define significant violence for you, but I really believe, I've at least 7 out of the 19 members of the military council used to work with me. over the years, and I have seen them and talked to them frequently. They could not imagine what they had to go through in trying to govern. Now, I'm not arguing they don't have their own agenda, but to be upfront and face the brunt of all the criticism in today's Egypt, which is different from Egypt 3 years ago, was something for them. Nevertheless, they're back in the barracks. They have increased privileges than they had previously, but I can't imagine that they will remain passive if there's bloodshed on the street. So at this point, they're back in the barracks. Secondly, we actually have the first civilian elected president in Mohamed Morsi. And I personally think that he won the election, that he did win the election. There are a lot of questions about that. Many of my colleagues who are non-Islamist, I'm not an Islamist, they don't believe that he won the election. My assessment is that he did win the election. He won the election, a tight race, particularly by Egyptian standards. But anyway, we have a president that's been elected. We don't have a parliament yet. Hopefully we'll have an election for parliament in 3 to 4 months. And we have a Shura Council. One of the problems we're facing, as I said, was on the Constitution. Constitutions, for me, at the end of the day, have to ultimately reflect, as much as they can, most of the stakeholders in society. They don't have to reflect the political balance in Parliament. This is not about who has the power in Parliament. It is, do you have people there in this commission who represent the different stakeholders in society? Because constitutions are meant to remain the foundation for all of your laws for years to come. They will be amended. But this is not something that changes every 2 years with the balance in Parliament. Nevertheless, our Constitution was adopted with 25% of the Commission's members having withdrawn. And it was only adopted by the like-minded members and others who were brought in as alternates. So I have personally a serious problem with the Constitution that's been adopted, and I will mention to you why I'm not the only one who have these problems. Secondly, we have a government that, frankly, doesn't know who's governing. And the reason for that isn't because they're particularly inefficient or more so than most governments, but the reason is we are really going through a transition. We have not yet finished putting together the system. So the president has come from the Islamist trend, the Muslim Brotherhood. Before that, they were illegal. The government are not formally members or not formally representing the same party. So they don't actually know where their political weight should be. Should they follow the president or the president's party? And given that they're only going to be there for 3 months, they don't want to support the president outright or the party outright and then be told, well, you did the wrong thing because you should have been in transition government. And they can't afford not to support the president or to ignore his party. And nobody wants to get into any deals with them because, frankly, we all know they're going to be out of power in 4 months. So why should you get into these kinds of deals? But even more importantly, they don't want to take decisions. Not because they're inefficient. Again, my basic premise with most governments is the way they're set up, they are inefficient. But this is not criticism of this particular government. Given the polarization that exists in Egyptian society today and the anger that exists, anybody who's accused of almost anything will be taken to court until proven innocent. So almost everybody in the bureaucracy refrains from signing any agreements. So even if you are a major investor and you want to go in and pour huge amounts of money into Egypt, and you go to the Ministry of Petroleum or the Ministry of Electricity, and you say, I'm bringing in the money, I'm bringing in the investment, this is a completely transparent deal, you will not find an easy address to sign the contract for you. Because if Dr. Nazar, and I know he would never do this, were to say, well, by the way, this could be done better if you have a Berkeley consultant, then whoever signs the contract will be taken to court until that particular person is found innocent. So in this transitional environment, we not only have a president from a party that didn't exist as a party 2 years ago, representing a majority as a president, and in the Shura Council of 80%, which did not exist 2 years ago. You also have a government that is not sure whether they should represent the president or the Islamists, or take any decisions at all. And of course, you also have the revolutionaries. And again, this issue of awakening in Egypt is extremely important. The elections for president, we had initially 5 candidates, actually more, but 5 serious candidates, in 2 rounds. First round, the result was Morsi came out. The one ahead, Ahmed Shafiq, who was the President Mubarak's last prime minister, came in second, even though he was a late runner. And then, amazingly, a gentleman called Hamdin Sabahi, who was a Nasserite, if you want, came in third, only 700,000 votes lower than Shafiq. And then you had Abu Futuh, who is a liberal Islamist, and the 5th was Amr Musa, who was looked at as a sort of a Western type politician. Hamdin Sabahi basically came out of nowhere. And the reality was, he was the ultimate address for the revolutionaries. They were worried about supporting. There were revolutionaries from the Islamists who supported, of course, Morsi. Those who did not want to support an Islamist candidate were originally leaning towards Abu Futuh, and then when they felt that he ultimately is a liberal, but he's still an Islamist, their choices were Shafiq, which they could not support because he was the last prime minister, or Musa, whom they decided not to support because he had been foreign minister with President Mubarak years past, and they gave their votes to Hamdin Sabahi, who came in as a strong third. So I make this point because even though there's a large majority for the Islamists, the revolutionaries and the Arab street in Egypt is still very influential. And they do still have a very strong vote, strong presence, because they can create they can take a position in the street, and on the street, which will have consequences for any politician. Why? I mean, if you ask me today, well, are you an optimist or a pessimist? Again, I will probably hide behind linguistics because I'm a trained diplomat, or just was a trained diplomat. But seriously, long term, if Egyptians remain awake, I'm an optimist. I seriously believe if they keep engaged, we will ultimately do this correctly. But I'm much more worried than I was 2 years ago. I see the situation much more polarized than I saw it 2 years ago. There's a lot more anger in the street. A lot of it is justified, and some of it is simply a function of expectations being so high. Nobody's happy with anybody in particular, and the situation is generally still in a state of flux. Let me just give you some figures to respond to what people assume to be realities. Non-Islamists like myself have repeatedly said the Brotherhood are losing support and the president's losing support. Well, that's true, but not as strongly as we'd like to believe. 63% of Egyptians said they supported the president after he was 180 days after he was elected. Now, he got 52% of the vote in the election. After 180 days, it's not a vote, but in terms of a survey, about 63% said they supported him. This was actually down from 78% 100 days. So after 100 days, and they took this American formula of 100 days as being a time to, which frankly I don't agree makes any sense, but the desire to move on with any president was so strong that it actually gone up from 52 to 78% in 100 days. 80 days later, it come down to 63. Today, it's actually 58%. More importantly, if you look at the participation in the different elections and different referenda. 2011, we had a parliamentary election. There was a 54% voter turnout. 54% in that election. And the Islamists, the Brotherhood and the Islamists, got 65.3% of the vote. 1 year later, in the Shura Council. The Shura Council is sort of the second chamber in the parliamentary system. It's not very well respected, frankly, in Egypt. There was a liberal boycott, and the participation, the voter turnout was 10%. So you went down from 50% to 10% in that election. Now, needless to say, with a liberal boycott, 83% of the votes went to the Islamists. The 2012 elections for president, 51% turnout. One would have assumed it would actually increase, but it went down, or was almost the same as that for the elections for parliament. Morsi winning 51% in the second round by a 2.5% margin. A 2.5% margin against Shafi, who was the president's last prime minister. So when you look at this, that the president's last prime minister after the revolution only lost by 2% against a candidate who claimed to be representing the revolution, it shows you how significantly the country is divided. As I mentioned, Hamdin Sabahi came in third. The referendum which we held in 2011, we had the first referendum. There was 41% voter turnout. In 2012, the referendum on the Constitution, we had 33% turnout. And of those 33%, 60% said yes and 40% said no, which actually means that we adopted the Constitution only with a 21% positive vote of all of those who are eligible to vote. More and more, these are indications people are getting angry with or dissatisfied with the process itself. I have repeatedly said that, and I'm sincere about this, again, I did not vote, I'm not an Islamist, I did not vote for an Islamist candidate in the elections for parliament, nor for presidency. So in other words, I did not vote for our president, but I accept him as our president. The real problem is, do the Islamists accept me as an Egyptian citizen? In theory, they do, but do they accept that I have equal rights even if I am in the minority, even if I disagree with it? Not only do I have these rights, but do they have a responsibility to represent me? The debate we're having back home in Egypt today is actually not, and I say this openly and candidly, we've been going through a debate where the Islamists have been trying to make the non-Islamists more Islamist, and the non-Islamists have been trying to make the Islamists more liberal. Now, it's not a very logical debate, but having not gone through this system for 60 years, one could assume why it's happening. And it's being done, in most cases, by people my age or older. So that also shows there's something wrong here. Very few of the young revolutionaries have become major political players yet. And we're still going through this generational phase. What I think we need to do in the next few years. First of all, the next election for parliament, I believe, will be important, but it will not really represent the revolution. Just given, politics are a science, not an art. Elections, at least, are a science, not an art. It's not done by emotions. It's done by defining messages very clearly, by having a grassroots network, by going out to the polling stations. And you can't develop that kind of system in a short period of time after a revolution. So holding elections so quickly will ultimately mean we will have a result that represents the past as much as it represents the future, the present, and very little of the future. It will be different from the past, but frankly, it's not going to really represent the revolutionaries because they have not yet had a chance to develop political parties that have grassroots support. The elections for parliament, which will come up in April, if we end up with 70% for either party, either trend, Islamists or non-Islamists, and if that happens, it'll probably be for the Islamists rather than for the non-Islamists. I think we're going to end up, we will be on the road of a severe crisis that Egypt will face very soon after that, because it will reflect a political system which refuses to acknowledge the other side. If, on the other hand, the result ends up somewhere between 50 and 60% majority versus a little bit less than 50 to 40% minority, and my argument would be this would probably be the majority for the Islamists and the minority, the strong minority for the non-Islamists, then I think we'll be starting the phase of correcting ourselves. It is impossible and incorrect to ignore Islamists in the Egyptian political system today. As I said, I'm not an Islamist, but they are part of our reality, and they need to have the right of representation in the system. But I say the same to the Islamists. It is incorrect and impossible to ignore the non-Islamist trend in our society today, and whether they like it or not, we are part of the system. We need to develop to elect a parliament that includes both of us in numbers that allows both of us to play an effective role. It's not having some sort of marginal presence. It's actually having a strong enough minority in there to create a voice, a counter voice. The second thing which needs to be done is, frankly, we will need immediately after that to take a second look at the Constitution, because there are issues in the Constitution as developed which, frankly, indicate a lack, first of all, a lack of understanding of what a Constitution should actually be. The Constitution should be the foundation for laws, not be dependent on laws. And there are several texts and several provisions which actually argue that the Constitution says blah, 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 as long as it is, or it provides this kind of guarantees, as long as they're consistent with the laws. It should be the other way around. You develop the law based on the Constitution. You do not define a provision in the Constitution based on the law. But more importantly, there are vagaries in the provisions which allow for interpretations that are not precise, and they tend to be in areas that merge the issue of religion and the role, the religion in governance. And that is an area, frankly, which really could create problems, especially in a country, and I say this proudly, by the way, in a country that is very religious. I have no problem with that whatsoever. The Middle East, by definition, Middle Easterners hold their religion very, very high, not only in terms of their beliefs, but it is part of their very being and what they do every day. So I don't think, and I'm not arguing, that we need to develop a secular system. That's not going to happen in Egypt anywhere in the near future. But I don't think we actually need one. I think we need to have a system where it's inclusive for all the parties. We need to have a system that provides transparency. People need to know what the facts are, why the decisions were taken, and who took the decisions. It needs to develop a system that provides accountability by way of the politician elected has to know, or in government, has to know that he can be held accountable by the public, and the public has to know that they can hold their politicians accountable and that it can have consequences. That's the only way to have a sustained political development in a democratic system. And finally, we need to develop a system that is actually provides for a competitive system between different political trends. And the reason I make this point now, and I would just add one last point, the reason I make this point is we have started too late in Egypt, and the same applies to much of the Middle East, to say, well, other countries had one party serve for a long period of time, and I can mention countries that are democratic, like Japan. Mexico was often given as another example. Sometimes people argue about, well, in America it's only a two-party system. I accept all that, but we're coming to this game rather late, and we want to actually learn from the lessons of others, not the other way around. And the last point, frankly, we can't create a democratic system if our different constituencies don't relate to each other. So when you're having the tremendous affluence that you see in Egyptian society and tremendous poverty at the same time, how can you have a discussion about a law that applies to both of them if there's actually no relation between them in day-to-day life? So this issue, while I wouldn't look at it as part of the Constitution, is an issue which we have to deal with very seriously in trying to develop this process forward. My conclusion, frankly, is we will be in the news for a while. Believe me, we'll be in the news. Hopefully more for good than for bad, but we will stumble on certain things. The next 6 months will be particularly sensitive. As I said, if we come up with a 60-40 balance in Parliament and a serious attempt to review the Constitution, then we can get over this turbulent period without too many losses. If we don't, I'm worried that there will be a heightened polarization, and it has reached a point today in Egypt where it is actually detrimental to a system of government and order. Just by way of example, this week, not only do we have the second anniversary of the revolution, we also have a trial about an incident at a football match that's going to come up for a verdict on the 26th. And you have both sides of that issue threatening the government. Those from the Ahli Football Club taking positions all over Egypt, and those from Port Said, where it happened, taking positions in that area in particular. And they're doing it openly. They're openly telling the government and judiciary, if you don't come up with the right result, we will do A, B, and C, or so on and so forth. And I can tell you, nobody is really sure how to take them on or how to manage this. The other point, frankly, is, again, how are we going to define who we actually are politically? Can the Islamists agree that they, in spite of having been 80 years underground, that they have now gained their right to be part of the system, but that's not at the expense of the right of those who are not Islamists? And will the non-Islamists agree that whether we can dream of living in Sweden, but we don't live in Sweden. We live in our part of the world, and we should be proud of it. And the Islamists are part of that system. Let me close with one point to emphasize these contradictions which are serious and are societal, by the way. They're not only political, they're societal. But at the same time, because they're so transparent and obvious to people, they are things we can actually deal with. I have intentionally not addressed foreign policy for all this talk, but I'm happy to address those questions if you want afterwards. I used to live 100 yards from Tahrir Square. So not only could I hear what's happening on the square, I could see it on many occasions. And right off Tahrir Square is a bridge called Assunir Bridge, which, in growing up, I lived in that area all of my life, I cross it 2 or 3 times a day. The American University campus used to be in Tahrir. Now it continues to be, but we have a larger academic campus out of town. Anyway, to cut a long story short, that bridge was always a reflection of Egypt. You walked on the bridge, when I was growing up, it was cosmopolitan. Every now and then you'd see somebody who was veiled. Most of the time you would not see anybody who was veiled, particularly in that part of town. As I grew up, you would see a veiled woman and a miniskirted woman crossing the bridge. Couples and boys and girls walking separately. It really reflected what you would, whatever you wanted, whatever you felt, you did on that bridge. Go on the bridge today, and I really invite any of you who go down to Egypt to do that. But go in the middle of the day. Don't go at night, don't go in very early morning. In the middle of the day, where everything is transparent and it's as bright as sunlight can provide you. You will see that 90 to 95% of the couples standing on the bridge, the women are veiled. But they're actually walking together as couples, and very frequently, frankly, enjoying themselves. Right in the middle of the day, on the main throughway in the middle of town, holding hands, being affectionate. And when you look at that, what are you seeing? The bridge, as Egyptian society, is much more conservative. Because in comparison to when I used to cross at a younger age. But the individuals are actually much more liberal. When I used to have to walk across the bridge with a female friend, if I wanted to hold hands, I'd drive to Maadi, which is a 10-mile out of town. And that wouldn't even be in the middle of the day. Today, they feel they have the right to, and I accept that they have the right, by the way, to do that in the middle of town, in the middle of the day, in front of everybody. And I say this, I completely respect this. I mention this even though it sounds silly, because it reflects the challenges we have in Egypt today. Egypt is full of contradictions. Rich and poor, conservatives and liberals, Islamists and secularists, Muslims and non-Muslims. But that's what Egypt's always been about. What's different today is you see this polarization of extreme conservatism, and then you see the extreme liberalism all at the same time. And that's why this phase is going to take some time, because you can't deal with these issues without affecting what actually happens in society. Now, as I said at the beginning, I have a tremendous difficulty in being concise and in being short in my comments, because I sort of go from one issue to the other. So I will stop abruptly and give you a chance to ask whatever questions you want. And seriously, feel free to ask anything you want. I'm not only from the Middle East, but I mentioned I was born in New York, so I'm thick-skinned either way. And my training will allow me not to answer questions if I don't want to, and appear to be very polite about it. So feel free to ask whatever you want. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.